right, it looks like we're having a great turnout, so I think we'll get started. Hi, and welcome to our April SecurityTrails Fireside Chat, navigating CISA's Shields Up guidance with attack surface intelligence. My name is Scott Donnelly. I'm the head of our sales team. If you're new to SecurityTrails, we're one of the world's largest providers of DNS datasets, which we leverage against a variety of problem sets, primarily our attack surface intelligence solutions. Together with Recorded Future, we help organizations better understand their internet-facing assets and help them defend from attack or compromise. We've been fortunate to have a number of great guests on our monthly fireside chat, including bug bounty hunters, the Verizon DBIR team, and a number of CISOs. But my favorite CISO is here today, and I'm excited to welcome Jason Steer, CISO at Recorded Future. Jason has global responsibility for ensuring the protection, integrity, and availability of all customer-facing services, internal operational systems, and related information assets. He has previously held positions at a number of successful security companies over the last 15 years, including Ironport, Veracode, and FireEye. Thanks to everybody that joined today. If you have questions, we will take them at the end. So if you can place them in the Q&A section here in Zoom, we will get to them at the end of our webinar today. So Jason, thanks for joining us, and congratulations on your new role as CISO here at Recorded Future. CISOs have made non-traditional paths. We'd love to hear a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Scott. And yeah, looking forward to the chat. So, my path was probably very different to many. Now, I started my career in cybersecurity in 1996 as an IT administrator, and I really didn't think that was a sexy cybersecurity job. It was building computers, building servers, building desktops, replacing switches, hubs, and that evolved into managing and deploying our firewalls and routers and other bits. So, it was break fix, and it was just learning as internet security evolved. Really, I was a security consultant in 1999, and this was the exciting part of internet maturity and multi-factor authentication, VPNs, email gateways, web gateways, and watching all those products evolve was where I spent the next 20 years with multiple US security companies starting in Europe, and I've just gone on that journey. And how I've ended up at Recorded Future is I ended up going back to work in the security team, and the satisfying part is going back to where my career started, actually deploying and delivering stuff that makes a business to my business, the company I work in, not for all of our clients, which is equally appealing, but actually getting back to fixing it for my employees, for our business, and protecting all of us. So it's nice to come back and actually be responsible for that again.
That's great. And I know our customers at Recorded Future always love good practical hands-on experience, and so I'm sure they appreciate your view when you engage with them and otherwise help our organization be very customer focused and customer facing. And speaking of customers, one of the most interesting things, and the reason why we had the topic for today's webinar about recent CISA Shields Up guidance is, I've been in front of customers, at Recorded Future for the better part of the last 10 years, and I've never seen such a response to the CISA. So it's the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, here in the US. And I've never seen such a response to their Shields Up guidance, specifically as it relates to potential Russian reprisals for all the sanctions that's been going on based on their activity in Ukraine. We've also seen similar guidance from the UK's National Cybersecurity Center as well. And just seeing customers cite in name the recent guidance, while obviously the government plays a large role in all of cybersecurity, just in name seeing this cited has been really surprising. So I guess my first question to you is why now? What about this guidance is really hitting home with major organizations?
It's it's incredible how this moment has crystallized threat and risk, and literally to the conversations on the side of hockey pitches with parents that my kids play hockey with, is that there's so much more media interest in cyber that is one aspect that has risen over the last year. But more importantly, if you look at Russia as a country, the Ukrainian invasion has caused huge concerns across the entire world. But if you look at Russia as a cyber nation. Its capabilities with threat actors is the best in the world. And I think obviously that combination of a very wounded Russia really having lots of issues itself to deal with right now with sanctions, combined with their capabilities as a nation to deliver cyber attacks that they've been very successful for a number of years. That there is a great opportunity for them if they wanted to, but I think not many organisations are likely to be in the crosshairs. But as we've seen from NotPetya, from WannaCry, and other attacks, there's a huge opportunity for collateral damage here that may not necessarily be your organisation, but some of your suppliers. And I think that's the risk that everyone is most worried about. Is I know that the risk is heightened. We've seen all these wipers hitting Ukrainian targets in the last few weeks, for example. This is an opportunity. It's a great opportunity for organisations to revisit where some of the gaps are that are most critical, and do those risks align with some of your gaps or not. And these are great times to patch, to fix, to update, to review, to prepare. Even if it's not this week, this month, it could be this year, next year. There's never time wasted in reviewing and revisiting what you do to look for gaps in your thinking and your creativity.
Amen to that. And so you've touched on a couple of these things, but for our listeners today, attack surface, it's become a buzzword, but how do you define it? Because it does have practical practical meaning to customers. How do you define attack surface?
So for me, I go right back to when I was a security consultant in 1999. Now, my attack surface is, I'm going to do a port scan of everything on your network infrastructure. I'm going to scan every single TCP port and find what is open. And I'm then going to try and map every single service to a product. And I'm going to start looking for vulnerabilities in those products. Now, I can remember doing this when I worked at one of the UK companies, Content Technologies, and there was a port 25 receiver service. And with the right message, with the right attachment, you could bring down that server. And very simple is you can stop services and create business impact from external just by looking at ports and information on those ports about software. And that at its in reality is your attack surface. And then you combine that with your most critical third-party suppliers that have access to your network that you need to really be worried about. And have you got controls in place for that? And have they got data? If they've got any of your sensitive customer data or employee data, again, you need to be worried about that as well. So that's how I consider attack surface to be, that I need to know about any changes very quickly.
So let's go through some of the high-level guidance. And so they put out, CISA in particular has put out a number of specific guidance related to Russia under that Shields Up campaign. So a few of the high-level pieces of guidance: validate that all remote access to the organization's network and privileged or administrative access requires multi-factor authentications. Jason, you and I have known each other for a number of years now. It's 2022. Why is two-factor authentication still an obstacle for so many organizations?
Oh, there's multiple arguments for this, but in my career, I've seen probably three things. Is it's really annoying. Don't make my user experience hard. And I'm not talking about the low-level employees. I'm talking about the senior executives who want everything easy. So they're the most stubborn and least likely to want to do this. So getting users to want the disruption that multi-factor authentication brings is difficult. So there's one aspect which is just it's not a beautiful experience anymore. It's clunky. And then the other part is, where are all your remote applications that employees are connecting to? Do you even know if you've got all of them? This becomes a difficult part. Is, okay, does this application actually, do I know about it? And the second part is it compatible with my single sign-on vendor that I've decided to partner with? And with SAML and SSO, it's getting a lot easier, but it's not 100% either. And this becomes the problem: is you can't have multiple multi-factor application vendors for your employees. You have to choose one or the other, and there are going to be applications that can't connect, and that's the hard part. Is what other controls, what other options do you have when you find these systems that you can't use multi-factor authentication on?
That's why there's no silver bullet. There's buying the right product, there's rolling out the right policy, but there's implementation and operationalization, which are two, they're not just another step. They're actually persistent challenges for organizations. And so I hear you loud and clear on the fact that not all products are always compatible with all authentication means, and so there's always some things that are out of policy. And which actually leads me to another question, which is how can organizations manage policy exemptions? Because we know that that everybody has the best intentions, but when there's a policy put into place, especially dev teams, product teams, they're rolling out changes for organizations. How can an organization manage policy exemptions once they make them?
Yeah, that becomes the really contextual issue to deal with. Who's the user or who's the department? What's the reason why we need the exemption in the first place? What is it? Is it data? Is it system access? What is it we actually need? And for me, this is where you start to dig into questions and get on the call with the third party to find out, how do you protect my data? What processes do you have in place? Walk me through how you protect other aspects of my data, my systems. Walk me through that whole life cycle so that I can feel more comfortable that multi-factor authentication may not be as important as other things. Mm-hmm. That I can put other things in place to minimize the impact of that, perhaps, and minimize what the exemption actually needs to have. And that just takes time, and honestly, it takes conversations with engineering teams, with the CISOs, to find an agreement. How can this exemption work for me and reduce my risk to a point that I'm happy to approve it?
Sounds great. So another one of the pieces of guidance from CISA was ensuring that software is up to date, prioritizing updates that and address known exploited vulnerabilities as identified by CISA. And so, that's one of those things that's sometimes almost easy to say to organizations because patching priority sometimes has business impact. And you just talked, I feel like you touched on this a little bit when you talk about how do you make a policy exemption. In this case, when patching, how do you consider business risk or business impact to a larger organization? Because it's really easy to say just go patch it when we all know there's downstream impact to them sometimes. So we'd love to hear some of your take there.
And what's been really interesting is how many organizations have had unplanned outages over the last few weeks since CISA's publication. Is BA, who I spend a lot of time traveling with, for example, and other organizations have been patching, and there've been noticeable outages as a result of that 5-minute patch never takes 5 minutes to deploy in reality. So, stepping back is just how widely deployed is this piece of software that we need to patch? How can we minimize the impact of patching at a time that's the least number of users? For us as the business, we've got our application for all of our thousands of clients and tens of thousands of users. So, finding a time that minimizes that impact is really hard for us, and that becomes difficult. But is when is the least worst time rather than when's the best time? And there is, that's a hard one. And for enterprise systems, it's a slightly different impact. That impacting our sales team having access to Salesforce, for example, through our proxies. The impact of that probably isn't so bad because they might not be able to get to the web for 10 minutes through our proxies. That's it's a trade-off, isn't it? Is patching our applications for our clients is obviously hugely critical, and we've got to think of many more people and their user experience, and more importantly, our SLAs to our clients as well, which come with financial risk that we have to consider as well.
And along those lines, so CISA highlighted, exploited vulnerabilities, and that's always been, one of my favorite parts of Recorded Future is always the context around vulnerabilities. And so, how do you consider exploitation of vulnerabilities as you're weighing that business impact? Because there's your CVSS score, which is, in a way, in sort of an academic understanding of how exploitable something is, but then there's the practical impact of it. So we'd love to hear, how you consider exploited vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities known to be used by threat actors when you are making those business or helping make those business decisions.
I think this is something that goes right back to the value of threat intelligence for organizations is, tell me about the risks to my business, to my peers, to my competitors. Give me that lens first that intelligence and things like vulnerabilities need to fall through, because for every time there is a big vulnerability out there, there's a particular group of threat actors that may be abusing it, and that's the context is, are they targeting my peers? Are they targeting my industry? How widely is this being exploited right now? All of those things give you the sense of, what is the urgency on this to act? If they're not targeting security companies, for example, or they're targeting financial organizations, that is all context that gives you the urgency or not a need of urgency personally. And, is looking at the capabilities of the threat actors, what's their history, is there opportunity as well? And again, comes right back to what versions of software am I running? If I'm confident that I've got these systems patched and they're targeting this vulnerability, maybe I don't have to worry. I can move on and worry about something else.
I'm into that. And so how do you balance some of the needs for remote workers? And in fact, I missed the bullet here, which is the next bullet is confirm that an organization's IT personnel have disabled all ports and protocols that are not essential for business purposes. And again, we think back to enabling a lot of access for enabling remote access. How do you balance the needs of remote workers with security? Because as much as a lot of organizations are calling workers back to the office, we know that there's many organizations, many industries, including tech, there's going to be a persistent need for remote workers. So how do you balance that new remote worker urgency with some of the guidelines that have been put out by CISA?
Well, I think the genie's out of the bottle, isn't it, on remote working? In order just for businesses to retain good talent now, the practicalities are that we need to keep our best talent, and remote working is here for the next 10 years. And so the job of security is about enabling the business, not about driving talent out. So through that lens is pretty much how I think every security team is thinking. How can we minimize the risk and exposure but maximize employees' working abilities to work remotely from wherever they need to, quite honestly. And as an organisation with employees around the world, it's a fine line to walk. But with multi-factor authentication, with secure VPNs, with endpoint monitoring, and all these things, you can minimise the risk. And then on top of that, layering that concept of what systems do you need access to? What data can you export out of those systems? Again, we can hopefully minimise which endpoints do we have data that's sensitive, actually landing on, which is a big concern. We don't want client data on endpoints that are unencrypted, for example. Those are the things that all of the policies and programs we put in place are there to minimise and hopefully eliminate.
That's great. So the last bullet that I wanted to review today is it says if the organization is using cloud services, ensure that IT personnel have reviewed and implemented strong controls outlined in CISA's guidance. In working with customers, this is one of the biggest challenges that they have is controlling that move to the cloud. It makes me feel old, but it's been 20 years since organizations have moved to the cloud. When you think of Mail beginning that migration, almost 20 years ago to the cloud in earnest. And so with almost 2 decades of assets that have been, whole or in part moved to the cloud, how can organizations really understand where their assets are when they've moved off-prem and implement the controls that CISA is suggesting? Goodness.
I think, obviously, this is probably a little bit of a plug for CecurityTrails, isn't it? Actually, I'll go back a little bit. This starts with policy around procurement of services.
Sure.
And putting rules in place so that business functions can't go off and procure services and products before security have an opportunity to jump in and make those assertions around the security posture of vendor A or vendor B. So things like certifications, so reviewing, which is what we do every single week with our supply chain partners that we care about, is to walk us through. How does data get in? How does data get out? Talk us through how you vet your employees. Talk us about your at rest and in motion encryption capabilities. All of those things that you can ask about and dig into, that you can ensure that you're able to present to the business before you've even signed up to a vendor. What risks are presented by vendors A, B, and C, and you can at least start making informed decisions before you even think about these decisions. But then the bigger picture is all the other supply chain partners that you currently contract with and may already have ended end of life contract with that you have to worry about still as well.
A previous customer of attack surface that I worked with, their solution to understand where their cloud assets was to process expense reports and look for developers expensing AWS spend on their personal credit cards, and then back into finding some of their cloud assets. And that's just a small anecdote of ways that organizations have struggled with moving either, to major cloud providers like AWS, GCP, or Azure, or even some infrastructure as a service where it's so easy to spin up, but it's much harder to spin up inside a policy. And so that's, and you said, you called out that this is in a way a little bit of a plug for CurityTrails, but attack surface, that's really what we seek to solve, is the ad hoc way that organizations are trying to understand where their assets are and create a programmatic way so that when a change occurs, you can ensure that it's in policy, because it's really easy to implement policy. You can use a CASB, right? If you have AWS and GCP and you want to manage your cloud instances, CASBs are great to do that. But we see some organizations that have, on average, I'd say about 20 different hosting providers. And we had one we worked with late last week that had over 100 different, cloud services in some way touching their global organization. And so there's no CASB that can wrangle all that. And to manage that change, you do need a solution in place. There's no question. You mentioned a couple of times, but I wanted to call out specifically suppliers. And how do you feel that suppliers fit into an attack surface? I know that it's a big challenge for a lot of organizations, but maybe look at it in a way of how do you principal suppliers fit into views of attack surface? Because there's a number of solutions to look at wide varieties of suppliers, but how do you really focus on your core suppliers, and how do they factor into an attack surface or just overall risk mitigation?
Yeah, so so I think we've already touched on a little bit. Is does this critical supplier have access to our network for information, or do we provide them information? So now that begins that conversation of what is exposed.
Is that the dividing line, sort of like if they hold the data or not, do you think?
Depends what the data is, and I think this is where the nuance is. What is the criticality of the data they have? Is it your client database? Is it employee information? Is it PII? All these different subtleties that. But equally, network access could be important if, as we've seen, multiple supply chain partners compromised. If you remember Target, through the air conditioning company. The dividing line I'm not so worried about, but the important part, which we're already doing as well, is we want to look at the attack surface of our maybe new suppliers that we're about to sign up, to look at how good or bad does that look. All those things give you an insight into security maturity, and if they haven't got remote access disabled yet on some of their systems, maybe that is an insight into some other things that we need to dig into that will give us more things to open up and ask and understand. And I think that attack surface, for me, is a really easy way for us to assess multiple vendors very quickly with here are some questions we have about what we've already seen. So, where do we need to spend our time next?
So I've got one more question for Jason. We've got a couple of questions that have come in the Q&A. So one last call for questions. If you have anything, throw it into that Q&A section, and we're going to tackle it here at the end. Appreciate those who've already sent in some questions. So last formal question for you, Jason. we've talked about attack surface intelligence a couple of times. How do you operationalize that? Because we talked about earlier in our conversation, it's a struggle to implement policy. It's a struggle to manage policy exemptions. There's no silver bullet product that can solve all these problems. But for somebody adopting an attack surface solution, how do you operationalize it beyond a tab in the browser? Because, the only way you're going to get persistent value out of it is if it is a part of a security process. So can you speak to a few security process or maybe key products that attack surface intelligence should, work with, either process-wise or integration-wise, to make sure that it's part of your living security program and not just a one-time audit?
Yeah, so I think, for me, is this information, even in my inbox as an alert is not enough. What it needs to do is it needs to go into your ticketing system, ServiceNow or Jira or whatever it is here's a new asset that we've detected. Someone now needs to go and follow up and assess what is exposed by this asset that has just appeared on the internet that security probably hasn't found out about yet, and you're now finding out about it right now, which enables then the policy, the process that you document your business follows by is adhered to, and all the steps in the playbook that you hopefully have can then be followed as well, which identifies all the steps you do now to either remediate it or acknowledge that it's fine and it meets your policies for internet facing services, for example. So I think going into the ticketing system, maybe going into your SIM perhaps, those are all good places. And I imagine given the vulnerabilities, there's going to be a huge tie over to vulnerability management teams as well, where now there's an opportunity to validate, is this asset exposed to the internet? What other services are exposed? What services and software is running on these devices, so that I can go and dig further and get perhaps some more confidence that something risky isn't exposed.
Amen to that. And that's where it can take it a little further. You mentioned vulnerability teams, but sometimes it's not just the presence of a CVE, but it's do we have a WAF deployed, right? So are there ways that we can mitigate if we can't patch, and can we put those controls in place? And so having some of that context be part of your entire security program is certainly key to getting, first off, value out of it, but secondly, heeding the guidance here put out by CISA, and otherwise just making sure that you got a nice secure program in the wake of a real global threat here that our customers are facing. So appreciate the back and forth, Jason. We have a couple more minutes for some of the questions that have come in. So let me pull them up here. Good question from JM. What mitigations would be acceptable for service providers that don't use multi-factor authentication? And so I'm
that depends.
Contract termination.
A number of things. How important is that service provided to your business? Is it your tier one SaaS cloud provider, for example, or are we talking about the HR system used for transiting off your some of your gosh, I'm trying to think of the word. Your students, your interns who work for you. What's the risk of those versus your tier one? And that's the subtlety that those acceptable mitigations look very different depending on the scale, the size of the quality of the data, and the risk to your business. And that's the hard bit. Is it depends, and I hate to say it depends, but that risk at those either ends of the spectrums is enormous, and it really does depend on some of those subtle nuances of all of the things we've talked about on here today.
So who's at the table? I say, one of the key things I'm sure our listeners wanted to take away today is, the CISO's perspective. So in your experience, who's at the table for that type of discussion? Is it legal? Is it compliance? Is it the CIO, the CEO? I mean, obviously it depends is definitely the answer. But in your experience, what are some other organizations or let's say officers of a company that need to be at the table to make that kind of exemption?
So, in my experience, legal, absolutely. Certifications, all of, ultimately, legal, are responsible for much of this. So, legal will have a very strong seat at the table here, as will, the business function owner, whether it's engineering, whether it's marketing, they're going to have a strong reason and argument to contribute as well. So security, legal, and whichever business function are generally going to be the people who are going to be at the table for those types of discussions about, well, if we don't allow this type of information in, but we accept X, Y, and Z, is that going to work for your business function to actually function? And that becomes the backwards and forwards as to what can we minimise the risk with to enable you to achieve what you need to do. And that is the mindset of hopefully enabling the business to do it and get on with their job, but doing it in a way that meets our requirements so that we don't end up with more security risk exposed.
Thank you, JM, for that question from Mitchell Wolf. And I feel like this might overlap with our last question. Are there other issues with the exemptions? And have you handled compliance with cyber insurance and regulatory requirements? And so I think the question is when granting exemptions, how do you consider any cyber insurance your organization might have, or if you're in a highly regulated industry, impact on regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of those exceptions, are discussed, with all the stakeholders. If we make this exemption, do we create a precedent? And then if we create those types of precedents, are we happy, living with that? And sometimes, I'm very nervous about making new exemptions because I'm very conscious that every time you make an exemption, that's it. You almost create a precedent for future, and there has to be a really compelling, strong case to want to change an existing policy or process, because the company's been doing it for 10 years at Recorded Future. So there's been a lot of backwards and forwards to get to this point of maturity where hopefully we don't need to too often, but when we do, we can. For example, if you've got employees travelling to high risk countries, we have to make exemptions occasionally. Not all the time, but again, supporting the business is the important part that we're trying to achieve here.
Well, absolutely. And so, and I'll say in closing, as mergers and acquisitions are obviously one of the biggest challenges for organizations with perimeter security, and kudos, thanks to you, Jason. Obviously, CsecurityTrails become part of the Recorded Future family. It's been a real effortless process, and you guys have incorporated us with all of our challenges, and it's been great. And I know that for a CISO, mergers and acquisitions are some of the biggest challenges that they face. So thanks for making it easy on us, and thanks for taking some time today to sit down for our fireside chat. Appreciate the questions. We had a great turnout today. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have some additional questions for the CsecurityTrails team, for Jason, or anybody at Recorded Future, you'll receive an email shortly after this webinar with a link to the webinar if you want to share it with folks, and a place to reach out and ask some questions. And so thanks to our marketing team. Thanks to Jason. And we'll see everybody next month. Thanks a lot.